William Hughes, Independent Media, Mr. Z's. You mentioned in your remarks that Eric Holder, the current U.S. Attorney General, approved rendition. So does that go back then, this business with the lawyers and the sort of business that we're talking about, does that go back then to the Carter administration?
That was in the Clinton administration.
The Clinton administration, yeah.
Yeah, it does. And that's when he approved, he testified before Congress recently. He was asked if he had approved any renditions. He acknowledged that he had. I believe it was 2 or 3 renditions. No details were given of what those cases involved, and so we don't know the facts about that. But torture is more ingrained in our intelligence efforts than Americans realize. And that's one reason, if you look at these CIA complaints on Disbar, torturelawyers.com, you'll see that we provide somewhat of a history of the CIA's involvement in torture. It's a long-term one. And so we really have a lot of uprooting to do to get our country on the path of being lawful. And it has to start with the president. I mean, the president is the chief executive. He's in charge of enforcing the laws, and he's required under international law on the Convention Against Torture to prosecute torturers and their facilitators. And so his decision not to prosecute is a violation of the law itself, and we need to hold him accountable. He's asked us to hold him accountable, President Obama. This is a good issue to do it with.
Kyle Hentz with Velvet Revolution. Just to clarify, beyond the question of prosecution, just to clarify, is it your intention to also call upon the president to dismiss the lawyers that were involved in creating the program that are still in place in government now? Yes,
definitely. I think that should be a focus of the torture accountability movement, which is a growing movement. On torture accountability last week, there were events held around the country raising these issues. And on votersforpeace.us, you can go on, and we have letters to Obama, to Holder, and to the Congress to take action. We will be pushing for removal of these 2 lawyers who are still serving in the Obama administration, removing them from office. That should be, I think, a high priority. There's no room for torture.
John Rizzo and
Fredman, Jonathan Fredman. So Jonathan Fredman and John Rizzo are currently Obama administration lawyers, one in the CIA, one in the National Director of Intelligence's office, and they should both be out of federal government employment. There's no room for people who facilitated war crimes advising the president on going forward. Question up front here, or middle here.
Hi, Ann Barron, United States taxpayer. So thank you so much for speaking as well you have done. I do have a question about, as a taxpayer, is there some way, we've been talking about tax resistance because using monies for war, but is there some way, the idea of doing a class action suit because our tax dollars are being used for illegal activities that have been shown to be illegal, would there be some kind of...
Pretty tough.
Yeah.
The courts are pretty restrictive on
who has standing,
who can sue, and under what circumstances. Unless there's a specific statute that gives some kind of standing, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
Any other one comment on
See,
that?
the irony, the court has made one exception. They've said that there's taxpayer standing if there's a specific explicit limitation on the spending power of the government to do certain things, and they've made an exception for religion cases, the Establishment Clause. If you think that the federal government is spending money that's promoting religion, you do have standing. It's a case called Flass versus Cohen in 1968. But they haven't said that spending money for an illegal war is an explicit prohibition upon the spending power. So the efforts to try to get taxpayer standing to challenge the Constitution of the Vietnam War. There's an effort similarly to challenge the legality of the Iraq War on the theory that Congress had unconstitutionally delegated the authority to the president to decide whether to invade and overthrow Saddam or not. The courts threw it out on standing grounds as well.
I think that was filed by a bunch of members of Congress, in fact.
It was. John Conyers
led the group.
And then Tom Campbell had actually gone after Clinton in the war in Kosovo.
So our powers are limited. You want to say something?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Yeah, the question of availing ourselves of the courts, and I do agree certainly that it's a hostile arena, and there's not going to be much resolution that we can find in that. I just want to reinforce the notion that each of the government's branches are going to be ineffective. The executive won't self-police. It's the foxes guarding its own institutional henhouse. Congress has already sullied its hands and sort of bought in to the paradigm, and the courts don't really have the jurisdictional hooks. In standing, you have to have a case in controversy. Someone has to have a particularized interest That's why Padilla's case in particular was allowed to proceed. So I just want to reiterate the theme that this is up to a popular check. That is the arena that we are now in. It is the last court of appeal, and that's the one that we're appealing to. It is important to note, and I don't think we've made it explicit here today, that this is not a left-right partisan issue at all. You know, Bruce's presence here on the panel demonstrates it. John Dean and his writing and commentary also reinforce it. This is a right and wrong issue, and this is about whether or not the values as a nation that we have long espoused have any traction when the rubber hits the road.
We're running low on time, but any last couple questions, if there's any? No one else? Okay. Thank you all very much. Oh, one more.
Harriet Crosby with Velvet Revolution. What's to stop this kind of torture from happening again in the future if it isn't exposed at this time?
I think that's the reason why, if you want to look forward, you have to deal with the past. If we don't hold people accountable for war crimes, and particularly the war crime of torture, future administration under future stressful circumstances could do the same thing. And it's important to note the Convention Against Torture makes no exceptions. Civil unrest, war, threat of war, none of those provide an excuse to torture anybody. And so, but if we don't hold these lawyers and the torturers and the people who developed this policy all the way to the top accountable, then I think a future president could make this same mistake and do great damage to the United States' national security and our own image of ourselves.
Then Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who was our chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, remarked, when these kinds of precedents go unchallenged, he says they lie around like loaded weapons, ready to be used by any hand that claims an urgent need in the future. And he was warning about that. He was in particular speaking of the concentration camps for the Japanese Americans in World War II. Guantanamo was sort of a microcosm of those concentration camps. And I think his words are well worth heeding. It will lie around like a loaded weapon, because in 90% of constitutional law concerning separation of powers, checks and balances, the law is simply historical practice. What has happened? Courts very seldom opine on this stuff. And that's why what we let happen politically is going to be enshrined in the law for good or for ill. And if we let this go without any sanctions whatsoever, it'll say there's a safe harbor. I can guarantee you no one will ever be impeached as a president again for doing all the things Bush and Cheney did, because they left with impunity. Who else is going to challenge up and say we hold this president to a different standard than Bush and Cheney? It's not going to happen. And that's what makes so critical this demand that there be some kind of justice done here, because it'll create safe harbor. All right, this is the amount of crimes that you can get away with impunity. Politically, it's acceptable.
Any last comments, Shadi?
The only thing I'll say here is that it's not just the case that the legal authority is created and the safe harbor, and it's not just the case that it's a loaded weapon lying around for someone to potentially use. We can assure ourselves that torture will recur. Torture remains ongoing despite the repudiation of enhanced interrogation techniques. Jeremy Scahill has done some really interesting work on immediate reaction forces at Guantanamo. This is basically the force feeding without anesthetic, taking a tube out of somebody's esophagus and ramming it down somebody else's without even cleaning it. And that's ongoing as we speak, not to mention rendition, not to mention the CIA's practices going forward. And then I just want to point out Bruce's note in the international regime. We've been talking strictly domestically so far. If the United States in particular allows these kinds of abuses to go unpunished, you can only imagine the range of abuses that will occur around the world looking to our practices as justification.
If people want to get more details about these filings and our campaign to disbar torture lawyers, visit disbartorturelawyers.com, and if you want to take action, you can sign up there to join in those complaints, either as an individual or organizations can also sign up there too. At votersforpeace.us, we have action steps people can take as far as writing to the President, the Attorney General, and the Congress to take various actions on this issue. And I hope that we will see some particular focus on Rizzo and Fredman, the two current lawyers who are in office still and who were heavily involved in facilitating torture. Thank you all very much for coming.